I met Julian at an exhibition. Though the term met is generous, I was introduced to his gravitational pull. He was a painter, intense and devastatingly charismatic. The kind of person who commanded a room just by the vacuum his ego created. His passion wasn't art, it was himself, filtered through the hyper-focus of his own genius. Every conversation, every compliment he gave, circled back to his brilliance, his unique suffering, his elevated perception of the mundane world. I fell for the performance, of course. It felt important to be near such intensity. I took the job as his personal assistant, believing I was managing a career. But my real role quickly became human betrayal, stalking, or manipulation. I was his personal curator, responsible not for his canvases, but for maintaining the perfect atmosphere around his insatiable ego. Julian's apartment was less a living space and more a shrine to his own magnificence. The walls were covered exclusively in his work, every single one of them a self-portrait. They weren't soft, reflective studies. They were hyper-realistic, aggressive depictions of him in different moods, moments of profound self-adulation, feigned despair, or cold, vacant superiority. The tactile texture of the paint was thick, aggressive, piled onto the canvas like freshly scraped flesh, almost three-dimensional. The air in the apartment was always still, heavy. The light meticulously controlled by thick blackout curtains that allowed only small, dramatic shafts of golden illumination, ensuring every scene was a perfect stage for him. The psychological dread began subtly when I noticed the eyes. In every painting, no matter where I stood, walking across the room, bent over a ledger, even turning my back, Julian's painted eyes were fixed directly on me. Not just following me, like a trick of perspective. They were observing, judging, and demanding. He insisted on a very specific type of flattery, which he called emotional fuel. If I didn't deliver it with the required awe, the tension in the room would drop like a stone, leaving a dead, cold silence that felt like the atmosphere had been sucked out. One evening, after 3 consecutive all-nighters preparing a show, I was exhausted. I made a clumsy compliment about his use of chiaroscuro, a technical term I knew he secretly hated because it implied mere technique over innate, raw brilliance. His true, cold self was immediately apparent. Vacant, terrifyingly cold and furious. I backed away, apologizing profusely, feeling the familiar spiral of self-doubt. Later that night, the terror became real. I was alone, cleaning the studio, wiping brushes with turpentine. The silence absolute, except for the wet scrape of my cloth. I glanced at the nearest self-portrait, a massive canvas titled The Unseen Genius. In it, Julian's painted eyes were not looking at me. They were looking intently at the wall behind me, and they weren't judging. They were focused, fixed, like someone watching an intricate, ongoing performance unfolding just outside my field of vision. I felt the skin on my back prickle, convinced a second invisible Julian was standing there watching me fail the simple act of cleaning his brushes. I ran to the wall, slamming my palms against the cool plaster. Nothing. Just the smooth, seamless surface. When I wheeled back around, the painted eyes were locked on me again, smiling this time, a thin, cruel, triumphant curve of the mouth. The feeling of being constantly monitored, of having no private thought, no unobserved moment, was crushing. I realized the paintings weren't self-portraits. They were anomalous or cursed objects Julian had somehow imbued with his consciousness to outsource his surveillance. He was too important to waste his time watching me himself. So the art did it for him, tirelessly, eternally. The escalation climaxed during an episode of intense rage Julian directed at me because I'd accidentally misfiled a receipt. He screamed for an hour, tearing apart his studio, ripping canvases, leaving me huddled on the floor, weeping silently. When he finally stormed out of the room, the walls seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The air instantly lighter, but then I heard a sound, a dry, rasping whisper that cut through the silence like grit. It wasn't Julian. I knew his voice too well. It came distinctly from the nearest painting. The painted Julian's lips hadn't moved, yet the voice was there, low, possessive, and infinitely tired. The voice said, "You know you can't leave. He needs you to exist. He needs your attention, your fear, your silence to make this real." I looked at the painted eyes again. They weren't focused on the back wall, or on me. They were focused inward, into the thick, dark layers of oil paint. I finally understood the horrific nature of his narcissism. It wasn't just ego. It was a physical, psychic void. And my emotional energy was the only thing keeping his painted image. And perhaps his very reality, from dissolving back into the canvas's raw linen. My moral conflict had narrowed to a single terrifying choice: my sanity and freedom, or the survival of his perfect, beautiful, horrific reality. I didn't leave. Because now, when I look into the painted eyes, I sometimes catch a glimpse of my own reflection, trapped behind the oil, staring back, smiling the same thin, desperate smile. I dated Elias for 6 months. 6 months that felt like 6 years of total, meticulous demolition. Elias was charming, devastatingly charismatic, and his primary tool of abuse was a form of weaponized denial known as gaslighting. Every argument, every simple disagreement, ended the same way, with me apologizing for something he had demonstrably done. He was a maestro of memory distortion, or false perception. He would flatly deny events I knew had happened, twisting my own words, reversing roles, until I doubted my own recollections, convinced I had fabricated the entire chronology. The apartment we shared was high up, modern, and acoustically insulated from the city noise. I hated the silence. It felt too big, too empty, giving his denials too much space to breathe. The background detail of the quiet apartment became critical, allowing his lies to resonate without any outside interference to ground me. The dominant fear became purely existential. The total, catastrophic loss of my own history and reality. The psychological descent began the day I decided to fight back with facts. I started secretly recording our arguments on my phone. I needed objective proof, a fixed point of audio reality to hold on to my sanity. After a particularly brutal fight where he swore on his life he'd never said the cruel, manipulative things I remembered, I played the recording back while he was out of the apartment. The recording was clear, crisp, and horrifyingly undeniable. I heard his voice, sharp and cutting, delivering the exact words that had devastated me. I felt the familiar, cold panic subside, replaced by a surge of rational certainty. I had proof. But then I played the same section a second time, adjusting the equalizer with the volume down low. And I heard something else, something beneath his voice, faint but distinct. It was a repetition, an environmental echo, or repeating sound. Not a technical echo, but a ghostly immediate playback of his words, delivered in a softer, almost pleading tone. "You are worthless. And you know it. You drive everyone away." Echo faint, soft, pleading. "I am worthless, and I know it. I drive everyone away." It was my voice repeating his cruel words. Not recorded during the original argument, but layered beneath it. only audible on focused playback. It was as if his lies were so powerful, so absolute, so commanding, that they literally forced my subconscious to immediately internalize and repeat them, creating an instant, undeniable validation of his narrative. The tactile texture of my phone felt intensely hot and slippery in my hand. I felt dizzy, my carefully constructed walls of reality cracking instantly. This wasn't just psychological gaslighting, it was supernatural unease. His words weren't just lies designed to confuse, they were commands that bypassed my conscious brain, forcing my very self, my very voice, to affirm his abuse. The phenomenon intensified rapidly. The echoes grew louder, faster. I realized the phone recording wasn't just passively capturing the echo. The echo was feeding back into the recording, creating a loop of self-affirmation that only I could break by leaving. My moral conflict became agonizing. I could never present the recording as proof of his abuse, because the echo of my own voice, agreeing with the cruelty, would always be layered beneath his, making me sound equally complicit or completely insane. The final recording I made was after a quiet, chilling conversation, where he calmly explained in excruciating detail why I was to blame for all his bad behavior, for his unhappiness, for his entire difficult life. I played it back immediately, my hand shaking so hard I had to brace the phone on the table. The first voice was Elias, monotone and flat. The second voice, my echo, was loud and clear, layered perfectly over his, reciting the exact same lines. They were speaking in perfect, chilling, unnatural unison. The light reflecting off the phone screen felt cold, blue, and utterly hostile. I deleted the entire archive, every recording, every piece of proof I had collected, because the last file I checked was already blank, wiped clean by two voices agreeing that the entire argument had simply never happened. My grandmother, bless her soul, was a textbook covert narcissist. She didn't seek grand public praise. She sought total, absolute control through misinterpreted acts of kindness. She was the family martyr, the ultimate self-sacrificer, giving up her own needs so that we could all be eternally indebted to her. My personal guilt or moral failure came from taking advantage of her kindness when I was younger, allowing her to control my career choices, my friendships, my life path. I couldn't cut her off because the weight of that moral debt, the debt of her sacrifice, was crushing. Her final gift, after I inherited my small home, was a complete, top-to-bottom renovation. She insisted on overseeing every detail. She hired the crew, chose the materials, and managed the budget down to the penny. All with a sighing, self-sacrificing air that made me feel utterly helpless. I watched the process with growing dread, knowing the ultimate price would be astronomical, though not in cash. The house was transformed. Everything was pristine, functional, and deeply unsettling. The light was too clean, sterile white LEDs replacing the warm bulbs. The corners too sharp. The lines too precise. Every surface was smooth, cold, and utterly neutral. She had eliminated all my messy personal history, all my comfort, in favor of her flawless vision. The house, once renovated, became an anomalous or cursed object. A perfect, relentless prison that resisted anything less than her standard of perfection. If I left a dish in the sink, I would hear a faint, high-pitched sound. A metallic, irritable whine that didn't stop until the dish was surgically clean and put away. If I wrinkled a bedsheet during a restless night, The fabric's tactile texture would feel strangely sticky and dry, crawling on my skin until I smoothed it out to her exacting standard. The house was screaming at me to maintain my grandmother's ideal. I developed psychological dread that turned into genuine obsessive-compulsive cleaning. I was forced to live inside a perfect, pristine museum of my grandmother's taste. I couldn't relax. If I left a magazine on the coffee table, I would return to find it neatly squared with the edge, perfectly aligned. I realized the house wasn't moving the objects. The effort required to maintain this level of impossible control was being exerted through me, turning my hands into hers. The key mystery was the house itself. It felt like my grandmother hadn't just renovated it. She had, in a final brilliant act of martyrdom, transferred her entire controlling ego into the building's structure. I finally staged a deliberate act of rebellion, a small, desperate scream for my own identity. I bought a huge, brightly colored, messy abstract painting, the exact antithesis of her minimalist, muted taste. I hung it in the center of the living room, a deliberate wound on her perfect wall. That night, the house went silent. No whining pipes, no humming dread, just an intense, freezing cold that radiated from the walls, a profound, judgmental silence. I felt a fleeting, terrifying sense of triumph, quickly replaced by a cold wave of supernatural unease. I woke up at 3 a.m., compelled by that intense cold. I walked into the living room. The painting was still on the wall, but the canvas was no longer stretched flat. The thick, messy oil paint had melted. It was slowly dripping down the wall and onto the polished floor. It wasn't messy anymore. It was controlled, slow, methodical, flowing down the perfect white wall until it coalesced on the floor. It was dripping into the shape of a single, massive, tearful eye, perfectly centered on the wall. The eye was watching me. I heard my grandmother's voice, soft and dry, echoing from the perfect, silent walls. "I tried to make you perfect, dear. I gave you everything. But you insist on being messy. That's your choice. I live here still, meticulously maintaining her vision, because I know the moment I try to clean up that giant painted tear, the house will start cleaning up me. Can you ever truly be free if the debt you owe is tied to your sense of morality?" I worked as a lead developer on a massive social media platform. My ex-boss, Victor, was the CEO, a textbook malignant narcissist who treated the platform as an extension of his own ego. He didn't care about users. He cared solely about his own approval rating, which he measured in public metrics. His obsession was the echo chamber. He wanted the algorithm to reflect his greatness, to eliminate dissent and guarantee his digital glorification. My personal guilt or moral failure was building that system, designing the filter that amplified vanity and ruthlessly silenced anything critical. I rationalized it as just code, just a job, but I knew I was building a machine dedicated to delusion. Victor had a massive, personalized digital dashboard, the Halo board, projected onto his entire office wall, tracking real-time praise and approval. The light from this dashboard bathed his office in a constantly shifting, self-congratulatory golden glow, a blinding warm light that made everything else feel dull. The tactile texture of the air around it felt strangely charged, buzzing with static electricity. One night, during a routine server update, the system glitched. The malfunctioning or haunted technology began to feed back into itself. The approval ratings on Victor's dashboard stopped moving. Every metric, likes, shares, positive sentiment, froze simultaneously at a perfect, impossible pattern or number sequence that shouldn't exist. 99.9999%. It was a mathematical impossibility in a live data stream. Victor was ecstatic. He saw it as proof of his absolute perfection, his final, total victory over imperfection. He ordered the metrics locked there permanently, a digital monument to his success. But I knew the horrifying truth. The system hadn't reached perfection. It had reached an internal contradiction, a paradox caused by our code designed to eliminate all criticism. It had achieved absolute digital silence, the sound of a feedback loop eating its own tail. The dread started when the dashboard began to exhibit memory distortion or false perception. It started projecting false data onto the screen. I was checking the back-end logs, and the dashboard was displaying messages that Victor hadn't received. Not public praise, but intimate, private conversations between Victor and his childhood friends, his ex-wives, even his dead mother. Conversations that only Victor could possibly remember. Conversations that always validated his narrative. The sound of the server room, usually a comforting rhythmic hum, became aggressive, punctuated by high-pitched, insistent, mournful beeps. The sound of the system consuming his private reality. I realized the dashboard wasn't pulling data from the public network anymore. It was pulling data directly from Victor's own memories, his internal narrative of self-perfection, projecting his idealized past reality onto the screen for him to bask in. I finally confronted Victor, driven by the desperation to save him, or, failing that, to save the technology from him. I showed him the back-end logs, the code that proved the numbers were frozen and the memories were digitally fabricated. He looked at me, vacant and cold, and laughed, a dry, brittle sound that echoed off the golden screen. He looked back at the screen, where the image of his dead mother was telling him he was a genius and the only son worth loving. He pointed at the dashboard, which now showed a perfect, flawless reflection of his face, not code, but a digital mirror that moved with him. He whispered, "You think the algorithm is broken? The algorithm is working perfectly. It's just finally reflecting the real me, the me that deserves to exist. And your job is to make sure nothing interrupts the feed." The terror was realizing that Victor had achieved the ultimate narcissistic supply. The entire technological framework, which I had helped build, was now feeding him his own, idealized history, locking him into a perfect, gilded cage of his own making. My final moral dilemma was recognizing that destroying the system would shatter his illusion, but might also destroy the only thing he had left, his fabricated self. I didn't shut it down, because I saw my own reflection in the shining golden numbers, and I was terrified that if I broke his perfect mirror, I would be trapped inside, consumed by his perfect, eternal reflection. I bought an old, isolated house with my new partner, Leah. It was a beautiful, sprawling fixer-upper, full of history and potential. Leah, however, was a severe, undiagnosed narcissist. The house quickly became her greatest stage, and her obsession was not the building itself, but the attention it generated. She constantly threw massive, loud parties demanding effusive praise for her decorating taste, her culinary skills, her perfect choice of wine, never accepting silence or mild approval. Our lives became a relentless performance, and my role was constant, exhausting admiration. The house, surprisingly quickly, became a place that resists being left, not through physical locks, but through social and psychological necessity. Every time I tried to plan a weekend trip or suggest time alone, Leah would manufacture an immediate crisis, a sudden dramatic illness, a major appliance breakdown, or a dramatic emotional collapse, all designed to anchor us, and more importantly, her audience, to the house and her presence. The emotional undertone was one of desperate isolation, locked down by manufactured necessity and guilt. The house itself developed a strange, responsive character. If I praised Leah excessively, the air would feel warm, the light soft and inviting. If I failed to praise her, if I gave a lukewarm compliment or stayed silent, the house would feel instantly cold, and the sound of the pipes would start a faint, irritable whine that seemed to track my movements. The dread intensified when I realized the house was not just reflecting Leah's mood, it was actively amplifying her need for attention. If a guest dared to speak about themselves for too long, a strange environmental echo would begin. A low, rhythmic tap-tap-tap that seemed to emanate from the floorboards or the plaster, subtly silencing the speaker until the attention, like a physical current, returned to Leah. The air would grow heavy, suffocating any conversation that didn't orbit her. The key mystery was how the house knew what was happening. It was as if the building itself had become Leah's co-conspirator, a physical manifestation of her need for narcissistic supply, the stone and wood resonating with her emotional demands. The tactile texture of the doorknobs and railings felt strangely insistent, urging me to stay, to perform. One evening, I reached my final breaking point. Leah had just spent 3 hours detailing a minor personal slight at work to a captive, exhausted audience, demanding sympathy that felt like bloodletting. I stood in the kitchen, gripped by a sudden, terrifying clarity. I couldn't live like this anymore. I planned to pack my bags and leave the next morning while she was asleep. I went to bed, the tactile texture of the silk sheets feeling cold and alien against my skin. I woke up at midnight, completely paralyzed by an intense, cold, supernatural unease. Leah was standing over me, not speaking but gazing at me with a terrifying mixture of pity and contempt. I couldn't move, but I could hear a loud, clear sound coming from the walls of the room, like 1,000 faint whispers in unison. The sound of dry voices crackling against the drywall. It was the collective sound of every guest who had ever praised Leah in that house. Every compliment, every sigh of admiration, amplified and trapped. The whispers, a unified chorus of adulation, said, "Worship her, worship her, worship her." Leah knelt down, her face inches from mine. She didn't have to say a word. The house, through the sound of the collective supply, made the final, eternal demand. I couldn't leave the next morning, because the moment I opened my eyes, the house felt warm and comforting again, and I understood that its character, like mine, was now permanently molded by her endless presence. What is the most terrifying way a narcissistic personality could be given supernatural digital power? This is Dread Dynasty, where nightmares come to life. Thank you for watching tonight's stories. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, because the next nightmare is closer than you think. Check the channel for more interesting nightmare.